Good afternoon, everyone, or good day. When we think about the future in general, we tend to imagine a time in which all the problems of today have been solved. And this is certainly true when thinking about transportation. Representations of the future transport usually suggest unencumbered travel through green and sunny landscapes with lots of happy smiling faces in evidence. These visions are generally aspirational, but are they realistic? This session was motivated for me today by one persistent idea from the past and the present of a potential transport future, the flying car. This would seem to be the ultimate transport mode, opening up uncrowded skies to commuters who may be stuck in queues and congestion. So we have three speakers today who are going to give us their vision of for the future of transport, and perhaps discuss whether we'll see flying cars flying over Leeds, Boston, or anywhere else in the near or distant future. But before we do that, I'm going to do something that we haven't done in the roundtable before. We're going to start with a short user poll. So I'm putting a link in the chat to a Mentimeter poll. So if you can see that, or if you can't, if the link doesn't work, the other way of getting to it is here, that one. And so it's just two quick questions. If you want to have a go at answering them, let's see, and I'll share my screen. So here we go. Good. So the first question, very quickly, was just to ask: is it possible? Do you think this future is possible? A future where we might see flying cars? So just wait for a couple more people to respond. So we have quite a surprising split there, actually, with the same number of people saying yes and as no, and some people saying it depends. If we look at the second question, so the second question was, is it desirable? Would this be a desirable thing to have, a flying car? Straight in there with no, 3 people. Okay, just wait for a couple more minutes. There seems to be a consensus around that perhaps a flying car isn't a desirable future vision, but perhaps we'll have more discussion on that as we go along. So I'll stop sharing now. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for taking part. We can refer back to the outcome of this poll perhaps later on. So our first speaker today is Dr. Paul Firmin, who has many years' experience in the UK transport sector, both within local government, consultancy, and the education sector. And it's probably fair to say that in his time, he has taught many of the current UK transport professionals and has a passion for the less well-ridden mode and futuristic transport solutions. So he's an ideal person to be on the panel today. So I'll hand over to Paul Firmin to give us his vision.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks also to Mujtaba for giving me this opportunity today. I'm just going to attempt to share the screen, so bear with me a second, and we'll get things on the go. I hope that this screen is displaying some kind of futuristic setting for you, yes? Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Okay, well, I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and that means I was heavily influenced by all the kind of sci-fi programs that were on television, things like Thunderbirds and Doctor Who and so on. So I expected the future to be full of rocket ships and flying cars and monorails, and I was drawing these at the age of 6, of course. And maybe my view of the world was something like you see on your screen at the moment. It isn't quite worked out that way, has it? Not yet, anyway. Maybe it's a good thing, perhaps. So it's quite ironic. I spent most of my career trying to, if I can get the next screen up, bear with me a second. It seems to have got stuck, I'm afraid. Oh, there we are. Good. Yeah, so I spent quite a lot of my career dealing with this problem, trying to solve traffic congestion issues by building and designing new roads. But of course, as soon as you build a new road, you just encourage more traffic. And maybe we've been giving people too much freedom of movement in the past. We've ended up with this terrible state now. It's awfully wasteful. These vehicles stand for 95% of their time during the day, not moving, empty. It's a waste of resource. It's a huge cause of frustration. Think about all the road accidents, 1.35 million road deaths in the world last year due to road transport. That's almost pandemic proportions of death. And we're allowing this. In fact, it was the sci-fi author Arthur C. Clarke who commented that the car is a really wonderful device, but no sane society would ever tolerate it, in actual fact. So what are the solutions then? Well, Italian futurologists in the 1950s were actually looking at possible personal movement pods like this, where everyone's got their self-contained travel space and all the requirements you need to go from A to B. Note there's still congestion there. And well, maybe something like this would have been very handy during the pandemic, actually, because we could have all kept safe and sound in our own personalized space. But what's the reality? Well, probably we're going to be stuck with the car. The car's not going to go away. It's going to change. Perhaps it's going to be electrically driven. Perhaps we will not be driving the car. Perhaps we might not even own a car in the future. If I ask you the question now, how many of you own a horse? Probably not many of you would put your hand up and say yes. If I'd asked that question 100 years ago, then maybe half the audience would have said yes. So perhaps in 100 years from now, if I ask the question, do you own a car? You might say, actually, no, I don't own a car. I don't need to own a car. So the future of transport is going to be car-based, but it's going to be other things as well. They're not going to go away. We're going to have to try and use these systems more efficiently, more effectively. Certainly from autonomous driving, there could be big savings in terms of road accidents. And that's something to potentially aim for, I think. What other forms of transport? Well, here's the volocopter, a drone, urban transit air system, which is being developed. I think Dubai is going to be one of the locations in the world where you can get this air taxi. We're going to have these systems. We are, because companies are developing this technology at the moment. Whether it's desirable to have a sky full of these, well, we've already seen Andrew's Mentimeter question on that one. Probably not very desirable. So who is this aimed at then? It's aimed at the rich. No change there. They were always traditionally, through history, the ones that could afford transport. So they're going to be the ones that can afford this kind of transport in the future. Maybe there's some implications here for drone deliveries and such like. But anyway, I think we will have this kind of system. We've got to blend this into our existing system. While we're up in the sky, have a look at this train. This is up in the sky. This is the Wuppertal Schwebebahn in northwest Germany. The amazing thing is it's been there for over 100 years. And this is something to remember. The future's not necessarily new. It's old. You will be old in the future. The world will be old. Our transport systems will be old. Yes, there will be new ones, but we've got to maintain and try and use old ones as well. Incidentally, this system, although it's been there for such a long time, the track has been upgraded, the trains have been upgraded. It carries 80,000 passengers a day. It is the safest transport system on the planet. Only 5 fatalities in 120 years. No system comes anywhere near it because it's segregated. So maybe we need more of these kind of systems. Modern systems as well. Hyperloop, of course, is being purported as the modern way to go from city to city at high speed. This thing can travel in excess of 1,000 kilometers an hour. Imagine that. Maybe with this kind of system, we don't need to have air travel, quite possibly. Note the vehicle does not have any windows. It would have video screens in it, and you'd have a film of your journey being displayed on the video screen in slow motion as you made your trip. Because obviously if you looked out the window, it'd be too fast. You wouldn't be able to take it in. So I see a blend of this kind of transport in the future. Definitely, there's a demand for this kind of thing. What about our city centres? How about this kind of Skytran system in Sweden that was being proposed a few years ago? Note these units up in the sky here are either electrically powered, or you can even cycle them. It's a sky cycle system. I think we have to think as transport planners how to blend these new technologies in to our existing towns and cities. And while we're in our towns and cities, what about moving walkways? Again, the sci-fi author Heinemann envisages a world of rolling roads. Maybe we will have this kind of thing to improve connectivity in city centres. Incidentally, not so good for disabled and elderly people because they fear of falling and find it difficult to get on this. So it's not a perfect situation to travel later. Maybe though, we won't need to travel at all. Maybe we'll all be working in virtual environments. We can conduct business around the world with some kind of augmented and extended and virtual reality system where we see each other as avatars in the room. Maybe we can cut down and reduce travel. We've all, or many of us, have had a good example of that in recent weeks with the pandemic. And finally, well, what we need to do to plan in the future, I think we need to make things more sustainable. Here's a packhorse bridge. It's been there for centuries. It's part of the environment. It forms a connection. We can walk on it. We can cycle on it. It's maybe what we've got to think about to make things more sustainable. And finally, my final slide today, what will the future transport systems look like? They will look like nothing like we know now. If we could go forward 500 years, we would not recognise the transport systems that the world will have then. And don't forget that people in the future will think very different to the way we think. They will have different desires, different needs, different attitudes to ownership, and maybe even different attitudes to transport. So I'll leave you there with that thought piece. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul, for a very engaging introduction. A lot of things to comment on there. There's been some good comments in the chat box already. So thank you for that. We'll move on to our second speaker now, which is Professor Marcus Enoch, who's Professor for Transport Strategy at Loughborough University in the UK. And Marcus is particularly relevant to this roundtable because his recent interests have been around alternative transport futures, both in public transport and around mobility as a service. So I'll hand over to Marcus now.
Thanks, Andrew. Is that the right screen now? Yeah. Hopefully you've got mobility and the future from flying cars to shoes and a Loughborough thing, that right?
Okay, we're not seeing your shared screen at the moment.
There you go. Screen one. Screen two. Ah, yeah, it's because I didn't click the keyboard.
That's it. Now we've got it.
Thanks. Perfect. Right. So often I'm in these sorts of things, and I'm the craziest person in the room. So it's quite nice to sort of have already a really lovely broad perspective on what the future is. And this time I thought I'd try something a bit different for me, which is basically to be a bit more conservative. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is some work I did a little while ago, 2015, 2016 in New Zealand, where I was a strategy director for the New Zealand Ministry of Transport, and they wanted to explore what the future of local transport would be in 2045. So a very sort of specific timescale, 30 years in the future, basically. And in a way, it's sort of my interest in transport and the future really got going about 2012, and I started to sort of see trends and things like automation, vehicle automation, and sharing, and collaboration type stuff, and just suddenly I started wondering whether, you know, the current transport system is actually going to be the same transport system as we go forward in time. in the end, I wondered whether, well, it might be, but it might not be. And this picture on the slide actually is from my favourite book as a kid. So whereas Paul was interested in Thunderbirds, and obviously that's a great program, and science fiction, I was interested in what my parents read. So this is an encyclopedia from 1953. Both my parents own a copy of it, and this is their vision. This is a proper mid-20th century British view as to what a city looks like. And I think what I've always found fascinating by it is the fact that this cityscape was probably not that different in 1913, so 40 years before. Probably wasn't that different even, 100 years before in the 1850s, except the vehicles wouldn't be motorized, they'd be horse-drawn maybe. But certainly 2013, I don't see much change. And then 2053, is it going to be the same, or are we actually going to change? And it's this sort of thing that I was interested in trying to explore. So fortunately for me, I got my opportunity to do that in this project called PT 2045 for the New Zealand Ministry of Transport. And essentially the way we went about doing that was we did a multi-stage process. And the first stage was essentially to do in-depth interviews with 50 experts in public transport generally, from around the world. Well, there's a split, probably about 30 were from New Zealand and about 20 from the rest of the world. And ultimately we took those, what their views were, and we looked at those. And then we developed 4 future scenarios as to what they imagined the future of local passenger transport possibilities would be. And then after that, we took these 4 future scenarios and we took them to 4 validation workshops with 28 sector stakeholders, who mostly were from New Zealand, to see what they thought as to whether any of these scenarios would give us insights as to what the future might look like. And by knowing what we think the future could be like, or where it might go, then maybe we could think about mitigation measures and measures of steering policies and practice, so that we could get to the scenario we kind of most liked, if you like, and certainly to avoid the big mistakes. So I've got some results, which unfortunately, because of this thing, is there any way of shifting this bit? Anyway, the key point is that these findings, and they're all quite similar. This one here looks at car ownership trends versus the likelihood of autonomous vehicles. And so on this axis, the vertical axis, we've got likelihood of AV adoption. So this is where respondents thought that we were very much likely to get autonomous vehicles. They were definite within 30 years. AVs are likely and AVs are unlikely. And I think this is interesting, because what we have here is basically we have about a slight majority think that AVs are definite. So 16 versus 6 who think they're likely. So that's 22 and 5. That's quite a high proportion of people, I think, who think that we are likely to see autonomous vehicles on the roads in that sense. And then the other thing is essentially this row here is, we expect, what do you expect to happen to car ownership? And this is fascinating. This was really surprising to me, because out of the 27 people who responded to this particular question, 22 of them thought that car ownership levels are actually likely to decrease within 30 years. And only 2 thought that ownership would increase. And I thought that was really surprising, because I'm hopeful that car ownership will decrease, but I'm not actually, I wouldn't actually say that it probably would. So that was one point. So AV adoption versus car ownership. Similarly, this again is the AV likelihood. So slightly, same graph in the horizontal plane. So 26 versus 10 versus 6. 26 think AVs are definite and 6 only AVs undefinite. This one splits it between, do we think that vehicles are going to be as more or less as they are now, with basically similar sized vehicles to now. So this kind of thing where you have some big buses, medium-sized buses, minibuses, and then maybe some sort of cars and smaller cars? Or are we going to shift to a system where we see lots of smaller vehicles, to some sort of pod-based system, if you like? And this is interesting because about 26 think the vehicles are more or less going to stay the same, but a significant minority, 16, think that they're going to be smaller. So again, that was reasonably surprising. Looking at whether we're going to keep, so this one is importance of climate change. So 20 thought that climate change wouldn't be that important, but 27 thought that climate change would be. So maybe not as much of a split as we would anticipate, I thought. Maybe I would have expected more people to mention climate change is important. Public transport usage, even split between those who think that public transport is going to be only used by the most socially disadvantaged as a last resort, and about half who think that public transport is going to be very widely used. Next, operational environment. So this is the importance of the dominance of the private sector versus no mention of the private sector. So 23-27, fairly even split between those, and the importance of climate change again. So 18 versus 32 this time. No mention of climate change. 18 no mention of climate change. 32 mention of climate change. So that's more important. And then that wasn't climate change. That was in technology. So 18 thought that technology wasn't really important, and 32 thought technology would be a crucial driver in future, which would make sense to me, I think. And then 5, these are the scenarios we came up with. So we looked at two axes. One was if automation advanced a little bit, so partial automation and full automation. And then this top one here is basically if we assume that cities get more densely populated, cities get lower densely populated, maybe is what's happening now with London. And we have some shared shuttles, connected corridors, mobility market, personalized pods. And then lastly, because I'm being moved on, implications and conclusions. So the overall, what the experts thought was transport systems likely to transition to some form of shared mobility paradigm, which could be sort of traditionally-ish public transport, but more likely far more shared transport like Ubers and that kind of thing, or maybe pods. Certainly a feeling that public transport as is will need to change if it's going to stay relevant, be more flexible, frequent, responsive, more reliable and quicker. There was a feeling that we would always have some form of public transport, not least to deliver societal objectives. And lastly, the government role in overseeing this transition to a shared mobility era is vitally important, which is, I think, the outcome that New Zealand Ministry of Transport wanted to see. And then further information I can send quite happily with a paper and of the results and also the overall report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. That was very, very interesting and very good to see some results from a real study in the roundtable today. Could you stop sharing the screen? Thank you. That's good. So thank you very much, Marcus. And now we move on to our third speaker, who is Dragos Hrituleac, who's a senior project officer at Sustrans. If you don't know what Sustrans is, because you're not from the UK, it's a UK-based charity/project management organisation which encourages cycling through the development of a countrywide connected network of cycle paths, plus other pro-cycling initiatives. So I'll pass over to Dragos now for his vision of the future.
Hi, can you hear me first?
Hi. Yes, that's good. Thank you.
That's great stuff. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's an honor to be among people with much more experience than me and hearing about all those ideas. So my name is Dragos. I'm working as senior project officer for Sustrans that Andrew just said. I'm doing a master's in sustainability and transport at ITS at the same time. So my whole world more or less spins around active travel, to say so. As in the past, I've worked with the Quiet Waste Network in London, working with DFT, improving the cycleways around there. I've worked in project management on behavior change projects and a couple of workplaces, and also currently I'm working in the Leeds office with Sustrans on the National Cycle Network LLC with projects as well. That's local cycling and infrastructure plans. So I think where I'm coming from at this point in time is trying to challenge the vision of flying cars, autonomous vehicles, and that ambition which everyone seems to have a real passion about. And everyone, I'm sure even in the audience, most of you will be here for the flying car aspect more than the cycling and walking aspect. But from my perspective, really, I do feel like that is something which is at hand and we can access straight away. So as you can see in those two, in the photo on the slide, those folks are frightened to cycle to work, frightened to cycle back home. But I don't think from the experience, from the talks, the discussions I had with them, they would be keen to be in a flying car anytime soon. So I feel like that's where we should be thinking about what the normal folk going to work every day, for instance, or going to school. So I'll approach the subject quite broadly, mainly with my sustainability and transport hat rather than the Sustrans hat on, mainly because I want to be able to challenge more freely the status quo and the narrative around flying cars, and not necessarily flying cars, but where we are heading towards, basically. Do we need that solution as such straight away, or it is just going to be a solution which generates more issues long-term, more challenges, more term, long-term, and then generates more hypermobility without actually a need for hypermobility, and then without any real benefits for the global south, for instance. And also, where is the political will, the technological challenges? Is that something which is desirable, or is something that is pushed by the current system we live in, really? And my third point I will be emphasizing is the active travel, which is at hand to everyone. It is an inclusive way of accessing transport. Mobility is there for everyone. And I feel like that's what we should be thinking in the first place. When we have that at hand, do we give it enough attention? And then probably bringing the active travel side of things, governance and councils and council of officers, as well as the high-tech AI people into the same room and into the same debate, because they all will have their own conferences and their own events, and they don't always talk to each other. And I feel like that is really missing, and that's where we should be heading towards. Are those flying cars going to help the everyday person? Or, as far as I'm concerned, I do feel like those flying cars will be much more useful. Like, for instance, emergency services. Do they have access to that? Probably not quite, because they are focused on the wealthier, basically. So this is my version of flying cars. Let's see if there's, yes, it does work. So this is my version of flying cars, where we have cars flying up our roads, basically, cars who are leaving the space for people to enjoy, for a more lively high street, for 15 minutes neighborhoods, for a low traffic neighborhood where people can actually enjoy the new landscape and the new streetscape. And I feel like that is where we should be heading towards. And that's what people should be realizing, that this is where the value lies in. And of course, everyone needs to be more mobile, but for short journeys, that is not needed. Flying cars are not needed for journeys under 2 miles. And probably we don't need driverless cars. Probably we need carless drivers, probably. People who can happily share a car, for instance, and so on. I feel like that's the ideal. And that's what we should be aiming for. And then when it comes to the need for flying cars, again, I would question that, I would query that. Would any of you like to go from Leeds to Manchester over the Pennines on a windy, gusty, rainy day? Probably not. In my case, I know that probably that would be quite a frightening experience, and especially that car which you have on the screen now. Equally, would that get me faster to London than a train? That's 2.5 hours by train. Do I need to be in a flying car to make that journey? Probably not. If it's a short journey, we decided that that is not desirable. So we need to find exactly what's the niche, where are they needed? Again, risk of collisions and so on. Is that a risk which we are willing to take? Is that well enough managed at this point in time? When will we have a safe environment where we can actually do that kind of travel? And also the last point there, flying cars are an option, but then they are not developed because there is a real need for them straight away. they are developed because there is a capital and people can go with that and roll with that. So it does feel like an artificial need to me when we talk about flying cars, or indeed any autonomous vehicles which would share the roads with the current cars, basically. And again, when we talk about, let's see if this video works. When we talk about kids these days, when I feel like they are suffering of obesity, depression, not being active enough, being screen dependent, and so on, will any of those new inventions, new future tech help that? It is a big question, and I feel like we need really to query that. Query our norms in terms of commuting. Is our commuter going to do it the same way as we've done it the last 5 years, or after the pandemic everything will change? Where do we need to research, to focus our research? Maybe it's more important to focus on workplaces and how we can enable remote working rather than enabling commuting in a flying car. Shorter working days, shorter working weeks probably, and so on. Is going to be 3D traffic engineering any easier than 2D traffic engineering? Probably not. So I feel like we should be really critical about it. And that graph at the bottom says that the distance traveled by car has increased significantly, whereas cycling has remained. This is the same. Adding an extra level of another option that as in the flying car option, that will just exacerbate that trend yet again. So it is something which we really should stay away. And that's the Dutch trying to increase, to look at the travel time savings. And obviously the travel time savings are not there unless you're a bike, and that's the biggest thing. Yeah, the major on the left is the new Tesla's car, the Cybertruck. It does feel like it's from a Need for Speed movie or video game, but it's not. It is a real car now, and it is immensely massive, immensely wide, immensely tall, and it is not creating that safe street environment which we all should want, really. And then although that's glamorous and that's probably sexy and that's attractive for the new generation, that's something new. Is that novelty desirable, or should we actually challenge those points of view as transport planners or transport professionals equally? Do you want your pizza to be delivered by a Focus massive car at your doorstep, or you actually want to have that interaction with the person delivering it? And you can always go into a debate around SUVs increasing, that sales of SUVs, the size of cars increasing, making them electric, making them autonomous doesn't make them any smaller, and that problem is not going to be solved. And yet again, when you have, I think we have sound on this, I'll stop talking for a sec. So that is essentially the schoolyard, which is full of bikes, scooters, and all kinds of means of people getting to school without getting their kids in a car. Those kids and those families took their lives in their hand on your normal UK British roads, basically, and that should change. That should be our focus, probably more than anything else at this point in time. And yes, electric cars are part of the solution, but then cycling for short trips has a much more significant benefit short term, which we have at hand, and I don't feel like we're always acting on it. And this is why we're here today, really. Local authorities or highways authorities not always taking ownership of what they're doing. You'll never see something like that on something like the image on the left on your normal road maintenance project, will you? And that should be unacceptable. And that's where I do feel like local authorities, councils are not always taking ownership. And again, solutions are at hand. It is not difficult to transform our cityscape, our streetscape. It is quite straightforward, but do we have the political will? Do we have the perception that is what people want? And probably it's not as visible, and we are losing all the externalities which are derived from cycling and active travel are not always. We are struggling to capture those benefits, but when it comes to externalities derived from investment in major transport, we are failing to capture the benefits, and that debate should be by far more in the public domain, and it's not. It goes unnoticed quite often. The most fair the most fair way of transport, of mobility, is the cycling and walking, definitely, but that gets less attention than anything else, which is not quite just. And of course, then you end up with press releases and newspapers with headlines like these ones, and that is leading the public to be frightened of what is happening. And walking and cycling can be seen as a terrifying experience for some of them. And the fact that the actor is missing in all of those titles, I'm sure they almost sound like self-driving cars at this point. It's a van mounting the pavement. It is a car colliding with a cyclist, and it is a car colliding with a pram. So where is the individual behind the steering wheel? Where is the ownership of that? Where is the actor? And those aspects are not criticized enough, and we're not accepting that there's an issue within that. In the future, yeah, just as a quick exercise, imagine you're in Dutch city with high number of people cycling, short journeys under 2 miles being done by bike. Flip that around, make 90 of those trips as car trips, as it's happening in the UK, for instance. Imagine what nightmare would that be to have so many cars within that environment in a Dutch city. And I feel like that's where we're heading towards, really, if we don't act now. And of course, when we talk about cycling, it's seen as low tech and easy to implement. But if you really want to, and if you really want to open up to that challenge, you can have charging points, which are like the ones on the right, embedding at floor level, which is really facilitating access for everyone. It is easier. It is a challenge in terms of planning, but definitely something which is enabling people. You have RFID tags, which will turn your light screen. You can have green waves. You can have bikes which will get a green light if it's raining outside. And I feel like we should embrace those and accept that that is the technology in it, which is available to us, and we're not really using it, and we're still letting the car rule the road. And if we should flip that at some point. And
so, sorry, Dragos. Shall we? Have you got almost to the conclusion? I think we're we're
just
kind of almost out of time.
Two more slides,
sorry.
Yeah. And then that was the main overall presentation. Now just a few words about sustenance and how we're trying to meet that demand through all those projects like Pass for Everyone and live as cities and towns. And that's the small things which we're doing on the ground. But moving forward, it is the engagement, reaching the community, reaching the children, reaching the individuals living on those streets, which we need to engage and make that change happen. This is a video which was covering those points, but it is not working. So that is pretty much my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. That's everything. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dragos. Very interesting presentation, a very passionate presentation of a kind of alternative vision of the future. So we move on to the question and answer part now. So the first part is usually around if any of the panelists have questions for any other panelists. So maybe Paul, if you do have any questions for either Marcos or Dragos, perhaps, in terms of their vision and how they compare with yours.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'd like to focus actually on the public transport angle that Marcus was mentioning. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that the findings from your research there were showing that car ownership might not be a thing in the future. I was just wondering what the age group was that was giving that answer in the respondents in that particular questionnaire survey. And also I'm just wondering what the future for public transport is anyway post-pandemic. You know, in my whole lifetime I never ever saw, as a transport planner, the government actually officially announce avoid public transport. And I think there's a fear factor there now. Some people don't want to get back on it, but some people have actually transferred to other modes and will never come back on it. Just wondering what your opinions are on that.
Yeah, okay, so the last one you mentioned, I think you're right. Lots of people have been buying second-hand cars over the last year. So we've seen a boom in that. And those were presumably previously public transport users, and a big drop-off in public transport use. And it's important to say that the study was obviously done pre-COVID. And the other thing is this drop in car ownership, the age profile of the experts, they were all, I'd be surprised if many were under 30. So they were mostly, experts, mostly been in the sector for quite a long time with I mean, yeah, so yeah, there would be older people. That's why it's so surprising. I thought, I just assumed that everyone would be thinking, well, private car ownership is going to at least stay as is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
That was the one radical view I think that was dominant. Everything else,
thank you.
conservative.
I've got a very quick question for Dragos as well. I've seen recently reported in the Netherlands they're allowing people with mobility scooters into cycle lanes. And I know that allowing people to even just use ordinary electric scooters in the UK has been very contentious. What's Sustrans' view on that? I mean, are cycle lanes available to other kinds of modes, not just cycles? And should they be?
Well, I think that's a big debate. I feel like at this point, officially speaking, we are fairly neutral about it because we don't want to say do this or do the other. But at the same time, we are well aware that micromobility should be embraced. And ultimately, if you think about what is on a cycle lane, if you look at the Dutch example, you have your restricted moped, to say so, most often going at a limited speed, which is allowed within the bike lane, between the cycle track. If they go beyond a certain speed, they will have to be on the road. And I feel like we should be open to those aspects. What the challenge is really is if you have those small scooters which are electric, which have quite powerful engines behind them, and that's where the conflict appears. Not because there's a danger as such, it is mainly because if something happens, you have the vulnerable always taking the hit straight away, and it's more difficult to negotiate who is the most vulnerable between a cyclist or a pedestrian and a mobility or a scooter user, for instance. Or if you have someone in a mobility scooter, for instance, taking by far more space, being a more wider vehicle, ultimately, it is again who is in the right. And I feel like it's the ethical aspect behind it. When you have pedestrians within their own space and you have segregation, that's fine. If you have everyone within the cycle track, probably it is a matter of being more courteous. If you think about the choreography you have in the Dutch cities where you have hundreds of bikes going through the junction, that's what should be aiming for. Like that should be becoming a natural thing. At this point in time in the UK, we are still fighting for space. We are still wearing helmets, where there is space for everyone, if we're being honest. But can we shift that perspective where people actually accept everyone else around them at a speed which is safe for everyone? And if you are going to be on a road bike and if you want to enjoy a fast ride, take the road space, take the carriageway if that's the case.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Can I just return a quick question to you, Paul? Like, what are the examples you have from previous, like past projects where there is technology which could be adapted for the future? Because you've had quite a few examples saying the technology, the solutions are here in quite a few cases. What else, what should we be looking at in terms of adapting what is currently available to make it future-proof, ultimately, in terms of mobility and future mobility? Because that was a good one, especially if you don't have to do further research.
Yeah, I think the important things for the future are to try and understand the needs of the populace. We're going to be living in a world where we've got many, many more elderly people, and some of those will have big mobility challenges. We also know we have to do something about carbon reduction. That's essential to the survival of our race. And we can't allow this crazy freedom of travel that we've allowed, because it spreads pandemics. It's not good. It causes lots of accidents. It's uncontrollable. It's too random. It's too varied. So we've got to look at technologies that address those problems, I feel. And if we can build those into some kind of sustainability and being respectful of the environment, blending it in with the environment. You know, that example of the Packhorse Bridge I showed you, it's been there for centuries. It's still an important connection link for people to use. It's now become part of the environment. It is fully sustainable. I think we have to look at new technologies and new materials, which surely will evolve. But at the same time, of course, we mustn't forget that people will evolve and their mental attitudes will change. And what we as planners are providing today will just not be suitable for people of the future. So we have to think about completely new ways of addressing these problems, I feel, and not building ourselves into a problem. I've spent my career causing this problem. I've built and designed roads that have caused congestion, have caused death. Yes, I've saved a lot of travel time. It's been good for the economy, but I've ended up with a horrendous problem now, you know, so yeah, I don't know what the total solution is, but we've got to be at least addressing what the problems are. We've got to be aware of what the problems are and moving towards making sure we don't cause more problems.
Thanks. I think Marcus would like to come in on that.
Yeah, a couple of things that cross my mind. One is that this thing about shared space. I think that's fascinating. I think sharing space more efficiently and safely in future is going to be important, whether that's for green modes or motorized. And I just look at Hanoi, and that's absolute chaos. But somehow everything seems to seamlessly work together. There's lots of accidents, I'm sure, but for me, there is a future where technology could maybe deliver some sort of Hanoi solution. And then the point, I was fascinated by Dragos' presentation and the emphasis on green modes and active modes and so on. And it made me think that, that we're spending 50 billion quid on high speed too. And what I always wondered was, how much would it cost to properly treat all of our neighbourhoods with new paving or new streets and make them all sort of nice and shared spaces or safe spaces? How much would that cost? What would the cost benefit analysis be of that? And it relates to a point I've seen in the texts from Anzi, who talks about less concrete in our new infrastructure. And there's another idea I was thinking about, which is basically rather than spending loads of money on concrete and all the energy that it takes to produce concrete and so on, maybe what we need to do actually is replace hard surfaces in neighbourhoods, particularly with soft surfaces. And then, there's a lady up the street from us, she fell over, she broke a hip. And if you had a soft surface, maybe she could fall over and not break a hip. And the social cost of that and the personal cost of that is massive. And I'd love to do a project. If anyone's out there with money, I want to do a project to come up with a cost benefit analysis of basically making soft streets and to see what the benefits of that would be. And so there's lots of future stuff in that too.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a question for all three of you on the panel. So I think in all of you in your own in your presentations really touched on the point that actually the key to the future transport system isn't really around technology, but it's more around kind of strategy and governance and making the right choices. And I wondered if you'd all like to comment on how we actually achieve that. So Marcus, for example, one of the key findings from your report was that the government needs to coordinate things. So how was that kind of translated into kind of change?
Yeah, so one of the big things is that the governments are very wary of tying themselves to one particular technology. And I know that Glenn Lyons is in the audience, and he'd done a similar project for New Zealand Ministry of Transport before. And they'd come up with this kind of approach where governments delay making decisions as to which technologies to adapt until the last possible minute. And the name of the technique slipped my mind for a moment, but it's like, yeah, it's sort of like how, as policymakers, maybe we need to set the principles that we want to live by and the objectives we want to achieve, and then kind of be open to new technologies coming along in the future. Yeah, real options analysis. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah. Adaptive planning, that sort of stuff. And I think that was maybe because we've been influenced by this report before, but certainly that was very much in the forefront of our minds as to how we go forward.
Okay, thank you. And Dragos, you mentioned that as well, the need to engage with the kind of like the managing authorities.
Definitely. I feel like moving forward, we really need to decide exactly what is desirable in the first place, and understanding that it's not always what is being sold to us as the solution from like big companies who are driving the change and the innovation. It is what is needed in the local community, what is needed at city level, at community level, even wider, let's say, because it is a matter of understanding what's the individual need, and it is a matter of understanding how your child you like your children to be raised, and it is a matter of understanding how would you like to spend your time within your city or neighborhood in the first place? And I'm sure no one wants to spend their time in a metal box, being it flying box, but I don't feel like that is the case. And it is shaping that narrative where the local authority, as well as high-level governance, is leading towards that, because it's difficult to have a bottom-up approach when it comes to this topic. At the same time, I do feel like it is, once you enable those people to make a change, and they do choose active travel for short journey, for instance, they will all enjoy their new environment. They will all love more their new neighborhood. And I feel like once we are able to actually exemplify that and present the advantages both to themselves and the wider picture, the cost-benefit analysis and so on, it is what is going to enable the shift and the acceptance. I feel like that's the thing, make it desirable. At this point, cycling is not desirable, active travel is not desirable, whereas being in a car, maybe it's more desirable because it is safer in the first place, and that's a big concern.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, I'm just reading a couple of the questions in the chat. Have you got anything to say on that point, Paul, before we move on?
No, it's just going to be difficult, isn't it? Because very often our transport systems are governed by profit-led business, and until there's a change there, I don't really see, how we can fix that problem necessarily. It's a difficult one.
Yeah. So Vivian has posted something in the chat, which maybe we could look at. So what land use, so if we were thinking about an alternative future, what land use or spatial planning would have been needed to make flying cars possible? And as a kind of like a related point, although the Dutch country use cycling to a great extent, they emit more carbon than we emit in the UK. So it's a kind of challenge really about the cycling, and is it really the answer to our land use problems? So maybe on the flying cars first, you Paul, what kind of urban environment would we need to make flying cars a possibility? How would it differ from what we have now?
Well, for a start, you'd probably have to turn all car parks into heliports, wouldn't you? I don't know. I mean, I seriously hope we don't end up with a culture of flying cars. I mean, I've got nothing against them as per se. I can see tremendous advantages for emergency services and so on, and rescue teams and ambulances. And but I would hate to think the sky was full of commuters using these kind of devices, really. Yeah, I mean, it could have far-reaching implications, because potentially you're just opening up more scope to travel anywhere, anytime, when you like to. And we've already seen how detrimental that can be to our land use. I mean, it's crazy. I can phone up and get a plumber coming from Manchester to fix my tap in Leeds. Years ago, that would never have happened. It would have been someone more local. I think we do have to start to... Glenn Lyons has a very good saying on this, it's live local, but work global, and that could be done with the technology we have available now. I certainly see more implications with that as to going some way to helping our transport problems, trying to reduce the amount of travel that's going on. Opening it up to flying cars, I think, would just be well, it's not a desirable thing, really. It could have far-reaching effects on certainly distances and travel patterns, that's for certain.
Thanks. So Marcus, did you
say
something on that?
Firstly, I'd say reinforced roofs.
Yeah.
And second thing is, while you're doing your reinforced roofs, you'll also turn your chimneys into Santa chutes. Okay, and the point of that is so when your drones are driving overhead, they can drop your parcels through the chimney Santa chute, and then they come out in the front room.
So yeah, Amazon delivery would definitely kind of take up that option. Dragos, is that right that in the Netherlands their carbon emissions are higher than the
I'll be honest, I don't have the stats, but what I would say, just throw it back to Vivian. Imagine all those short journeys which are done by bike being done in a car, and that is the issue. And I feel like if we're heading towards that, it is a trap for everyone to fall in, and we should avoid it at all costs. And surely, if as a country have that policy where all your short journeys are done using active modes, you are going to help it. It is not saying that long journeys will not happen. They travel as much as we do. They have probably more cars than we do per person. I feel like that is the reality. We shouldn't be against that. That will still happen. People still will go on holidays and so on. It is short journeys which have to be done using sustainable modes.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So we're kind of coming to the end of the time. Just one final question to all three panelists, a bit of a cheeky one, but if you had funding for 1,000 new transport professional roles, what types of people would you wish to recruit to kind of like make the change? Marcus, you've got your hand up there. You want to go first on that one?
I asked this question the other week by the Wall Street Journal, and they were looking at what are the jobs in the future transport system. And I think for me, there was two kinds of jobs stood out. So one is there's the ones around data scientists and around machine learning and all that kind of stuff, the real transport modeling stuff, but next generation. And then the other side, I think, there's a real need, that there will be a real need for lots of people-facing jobs. So, you know, this high-touch idea. So even though we might have autonomous cars, I think there'll still be quite a desire for people basically to employ escorts, for want of a better word. People basically who can carry luggage, porters, if you like, from the past. So there's kind of like public-facing type skills and that sort of stuff, and then these very hard computer science, network optimization type people. And I think that hopefully we're at Loughborough, we're going to try and do this. So a little bit of a plug here. We're starting a new MSc in Intelligent Transport Systems from this coming October. So you can send anybody you think needs those skills for these jobs of the future to us from October. Thanks.
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks for that. What about you, Paul? How would you use 1,000 new roles?
I'd probably go looking for some gardeners, some health experts, and also some psychologists. And then I'd throw in a nice mix of computer programmers and VR specialists. I think there's going to be a whole growth area there. Interestingly enough, I mean, this automated vehicle revolution that's coming could have big and far-reaching implications for employment. You think how many people are involved in their daily lives as some kind of a driver of a vehicle? If you take that kind of role away, what are they going to do in society? What are the new jobs for them to do? That's a big question.
Yeah, I think it's the largest number of jobs in America, certainly blue collar jobs in America, is truck drivers, isn't it? Something like that, truck and van drivers.
Yeah, it's a big employment sector. And how would you use the roles, Dragos? Just finally,
if you get a new batch of transport planners and transport people in general, I feel like should be those who are challenging the status quo, who are looking at the social sustainability of aspects of things. Would the flying car or drone help the poor communities in Africa carry drinking water to the local community? Would that be a challenge for a transport planner in a bigger context? Or in the UK, if you take it, could we have transport people focusing on active travel, for instance, in all councils and in all schools and all hospitals where you have high workforce and all big employment centers, because you need that direct interaction to actually support that shift. And if that's not happening, we won't really make progress on that front. And that's where I feel like the new transport or new generation of transport people should be focusing on.
Thank you. That's
or a proportion
very good.
Of them,
Yeah,
at least.
that's a very good answer. I mean, the thing that occurred to me was that maybe you need to employ all these people in marketing and publicity and advertising to kind of communicate a different message about transportation. It's kind of related to what you were saying about embedding transport professionals into large organizations to create sustainable change. So we've actually reached the end of the time. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'll hand over to Mojtaba to close the session and to put in a plug for the next next one.
Thank you. It was an excellent roundtable. Thanks to the speakers and to the amazing audience.
Yeah.
We had two roundtables going on, and very insightful. I'll quickly plug our next roundtable. As always, our roundtables are the third Thursday of the month. Is mobility and cinema, their mutual influence. So we're going to address some of the questions that also Glenn raised about art, and we've done an art one, and we're focusing on cinema next for next roundtable. And I'm going to put the link here in case you want to register in advance. And it has been great. As always, please, if you have any topics in mind you would like to cover or any specific speakers you would like us to invite, please do respond to either my or Andrew's email. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you very much to our speakers, to Marcus, to Paul, and to Dragos for a really useful, good discussion. And we'll see you all in June. Take care. Bye-bye for now.